Benjamin Franklin, Life and Discoveries, Part 1. Imagine walking down a narrow cobblestone street in Boston in the year 1710. The smell of the sea mingles with smoke from hearth fires. You hear the clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the cry of merchants selling molasses and fish, and the chatter of boys running errands in wool caps and worn shoes. Among them is one boy, barefoot and carrying a basket of candles. His name is Benjamin Franklin. He's only 4 years old when his family moves to a new house on Milk Street, but the restless curiosity that would define his life is already burning inside him. Benjamin Franklin's story begins humbly, in a large and bustling family. He was born on January 17, 1706, the 15th of 17 children. His father, Josiah Franklin, was a candle and soap maker, a tradesman scraping together a living in colonial Boston. Benjamin's mother, Abia Folger, came from a family of Puritan settlers in Nantucket. She was intelligent, strong-willed, and deeply practical. Together, they raised a house full of noise, work, and prayer. Josiah hoped his youngest son would become a minister, a respected profession in Puritan New England. But money was tight, and the family couldn't afford the education it required. Benjamin attended the Boston Latin School for just 2 years before being pulled out to work in his father's shop. Yet the boy's mind refused to sit still. He read everything he could find, the Bible, Plutarch's Lives, Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, and whatever newspapers or pamphlets he could get his hands on. Books became his true teachers. By the age of 12, Franklin was apprenticed to his older brother James, a printer. The printing press, loud, messy, and magical, changed Benjamin's life. He learned to set type, mix ink, and operate the heavy wooden press. More importantly, he discovered the power of words. James published the New England Courant, one of the first independent newspapers in America. Benjamin delivered copies around town, secretly devouring every article. But James was strict, even cruel, and Franklin longed to write for the paper himself. Knowing his brother would never allow it, Benjamin invented a disguise. Under the pen name, Silence Dogood, he began slipping letters under the print shop door at night, witty essays written as if by a wise widow commenting on society, politics, and manners. To James's surprise, Mrs. Dogood's letters became popular with readers. When the truth came out, that the clever widow was actually his teenage apprentice, James was furious. The brothers quarreled, and at 17, Benjamin ran away. It was 1723. A runaway apprentice could be arrested, yet Franklin was determined to find freedom. With a few coins in his pocket and bread under his arm, he walked out of Boston and headed toward New York, and then Philadelphia, a city he'd never seen, in a colony that promised opportunity. The image of Franklin's arrival in Philadelphia became legendary. Picture him, a tall, awkward young man, his clothes wrinkled from travel, pockets stuffed with dirty shirts. He's carrying 3 rolls of bread, eating one as he walks down Market Street. A young woman named Deborah Reed watches from a doorway and laughs at the sight. She would later become his wife. Philadelphia, even then, was a city of ideas. It was a place built by Quakers, known for tolerance, trade, and a belief in progress. Franklin quickly found work as a printer, earning a reputation for diligence and skill. Soon, he caught the attention of a man who would change his life, Samuel Keimer, a printer who hired him and introduced him to Pennsylvania's intellectual circles. Franklin's wit, curiosity, and practical mind won him friends and patrons, including the colonial governor, Sir William Keith. Keith promised to help Franklin set up his own printing business. He even suggested the young man sail to London to buy equipment and make professional contacts. Franklin, barely 20 years old, agreed. He packed his hopes, said goodbye to Deborah Reed, and boarded a ship to England, confident that his future was secure. But when he arrived in London in 1724, he discovered a harsh truth: the governor's promises were empty. There were no letters of credit, no funds, no support. Franklin was alone in a foreign city, jobless and broke. Yet he refused to despair. He found work in London print shops, where his talent and reliability soon earned him respect. He observed how the great city functioned, its science, commerce, and culture. He read voraciously, studied languages, and wrote essays about morality, religion, and human improvement. These early years shaped Franklin's philosophy. He saw that success wasn't just about luck or birth, it came from discipline, curiosity, and character. In London, he began experimenting with vegetarianism, waking early, and setting daily goals for himself. He dreamed of living a life guided by virtue and reason, ideas that would define him for decades to come. After nearly 2 years abroad, Franklin returned to Philadelphia in 1726. He was 20 years old and more determined than ever to make something of himself. He worked briefly as a bookkeeper, then as a printer again. Within a few years, he opened his own shop with a partner, Hugh Meredith. Franklin's press quickly became one of the best in the colonies. His skill with words and sharp sense of humor made his pamphlets and newspapers stand out. In 1729, he took over a struggling publication called the Pennsylvania Gazette. Under his management, it became the most influential paper in the colonies, filled with essays, satire, and news that encouraged public debate. Franklin used it not only to inform but to shape the civic spirit of Philadelphia. He urged citizens to improve their city, to clean the streets, support education, and help the poor. That same restless curiosity drove Franklin into one of his earliest public projects, the creation of a lending library. He and a group of friends founded the Library Company of Philadelphia, allowing ordinary citizens to share books, a revolutionary idea at the time. Knowledge, Franklin believed, should be accessible to all. As his business prospered, he married Deborah Read, the same woman who had laughed at him when he arrived in Philadelphia years earlier. Together, they ran a household that became a hub of warmth, conversation, and enterprise. They raised children, including Franklin's beloved son William, and took in boarders and apprentices. But Franklin was never satisfied with comfort alone. He began to think bigger, about science, invention, and the improvement of human life. His evenings were filled with experiments, and his mornings with meetings of the Junto, a club he founded for mutual improvement. The members, craftsmen, merchants, and thinkers, met every Friday to discuss ideas about morality, science, and community. Through these gatherings, Franklin became a new kind of man in colonial America, not just a tradesman, but a philosopher of practicality. He believed that knowledge was valuable only if it could make life better. He once wrote, "The noblest question in the world is, what good may I do in it?" In the coming years, that question would drive him to invent devices that changed everyday life, the Franklin stove, which made homes warmer and safer, the lightning rod, which protected buildings from storms, and the bifocal glasses that improved his own failing eyesight. But before those inventions came fame, there was still struggle. Franklin's ambition often ran up against the limits of colonial society. America in the 1730s was still provincial, its roads rough and its people divided by religion, class, and ignorance. But Franklin saw potential, a chance to build something better from the ground up. He devoted his time to civic projects, improving fire safety, organizing a volunteer fire company, founding a hospital, and establishing a public academy that would later become the University of Pennsylvania. Everywhere he looked, he saw problems, and solutions. By the time he reached his 40s, Benjamin Franklin had transformed from a runaway apprentice into one of the most respected men in the colonies, a printer, writer, inventor, and civic leader. Yet even as his fame grew, so did his curiosity. He began to look upward, literally, at the sky and the mysterious power of lightning that danced across it. The boy who once made candles in his father's shop was now ready to capture the fire of the heavens. Benjamin Franklin, Life and Discoveries, Part 2. By the late 1740s, Benjamin Franklin was no longer just a printer or businessman, he had become something larger, something America had rarely seen before, a man devoted entirely to curiosity, reason, and the pursuit of knowledge for its own sake. The young runaway from Boston had built a prosperous life in Philadelphia, but now he sought to understand the hidden forces of the universe. And the force that fascinated him most was electricity. At the time, electricity was a mystery, a parlor trick for the wealthy, something entertainers used to shock curious audiences in European salons. Static charges could make hair stand on end, or cause sparks to jump from metal rods. Scientists in England, France, and Germany were experimenting with it, but no one truly understood what it was or how it behaved. Franklin, with his relentless curiosity, decided to investigate. He began by reading every paper he could find on the subject and building his own equipment from scratch. Glass tubes, wire, corks, silk, the tools of a colonial experimenter. But Franklin didn't just repeat others' experiments. He asked new questions. What was electricity made of? Could it be stored? Did it move through materials? Could lightning be the same thing as these tiny sparks in a jar? He was methodical but playful, calling electricity, the wonderful power of fire from heaven. He noticed that when he rubbed a glass tube, it seemed to attract light objects, just as amber did when rubbed with cloth. He began using words that would shape science forever: positive and negative charge, battery, conductor, and electrify. These terms came from Franklin's pen, his own inventions of language for a force no one could see. In 1747, he began performing public experiments in Philadelphia. Friends and scholars watched as he demonstrated sparks leaping from metal points, paper catching fire from invisible energy, and bells ringing without touch. The audience gasped, but Franklin's calm explanations made even the impossible seem logical. He built the famous Leyden jar battery, a collection of glass jars capable of storing electrical charge. When connected, they could deliver a powerful jolt. Franklin and his friends took turns shocking themselves, laughing and grimacing in the name of science. But behind the humor was genius. Franklin began to suspect that lightning, that great fiery serpent in the sky, was simply electricity on a massive scale. The idea was revolutionary. Until then, lightning was seen as divine punishment, a weapon of the heavens. To claim it was a natural phenomenon, a force that could be measured and perhaps controlled, was both daring and heretical. So Franklin decided to test his theory. He first proposed an experiment in 1750, to build a tall, pointed rod atop a tower or church and see if it could draw lightning from the clouds. But Philadelphia didn't yet have the kind of tall structures he needed, so he came up with something simpler, and far more famous. It was a stormy afternoon in June 1752 when Franklin, his son William, and a few helpers walked into an open field carrying a silk kite. The kite was simple: a cross of cedar sticks, a silk handkerchief for the sail, a metal key tied to the hemp string, and a thin silk ribbon to keep the experimenter insulated. Franklin's plan was elegant: if lightning and electricity were the same, the key should collect an electrical charge from the storm clouds. He launched the kite into the gray, churning sky as thunder rolled in the distance. For a long moment, nothing. Then, the loose fibers of the string began to stand up. Franklin touched the key, and a spark jumped, faint, but unmistakable. Electricity. He had proven that lightning and electricity were one and the same. The discovery electrified, quite literally, the world. Franklin's name spread across Europe. Scientists in London and Paris confirmed his results, and the Philadelphia experiments became a sensation. Voltaire praised him, French aristocrats toasted him, and the King of France himself commissioned lightning rods to protect his palaces. The lightning rod became Franklin's most famous invention. It was a simple device, a pointed metal rod mounted on the roof, connected by a wire to the ground, yet it saved countless lives and buildings from fire. Franklin had, in essence, tamed the lightning. But to him, the discovery wasn't about glory. It was about utility, the belief that knowledge should serve humanity. He once said, "What signifies philosophy that does not apply to some use?" Still, fame found him. In 1753, the Royal Society of London awarded him the prestigious Copley Medal, one of the highest honors in science. The University of St Andrews in Scotland granted him an honorary doctorate, the reason he would forever be known as Dr. Franklin. While Europe celebrated him as a modern Prometheus, Franklin remained deeply involved in civic life back home. His scientific fame gave him influence, and he used it to improve Philadelphia. He organized America's first volunteer fire department, helped establish a public hospital, and modernized the city's postal system. As Postmaster General, Franklin revolutionized communication in the colonies. He mapped more efficient delivery routes, introduced regular schedules, and even measured distances with a personal invention, odometer, attached to his carriage wheel. His improvements cut delivery times dramatically and helped unite the scattered colonies through faster exchange of ideas and information. Franklin's mind was always multitasking. Science, business, politics, and philosophy were threads woven into one life. He wrote essays on population, climate, and the moral improvement of mankind. He developed the Franklin stove, a safer and more efficient heating system for homes. He invented bifocal glasses, tired of constantly swapping between reading and distance lenses. He even experimented with musical instruments, designing a glass harmonica, a series of spinning glass bowls that produced hauntingly beautiful tones. Mozart and Beethoven would later compose for it. Everywhere Franklin went, he brought practicality and humor. When asked how he had achieved so much, he smiled and said, "Diligence is the mother of good luck." Yet as the 1750s progressed, Franklin's attention began to turn from science to politics. The colonies were growing restless under British rule. Tensions simmered over taxes, representation, and the rights of free men. Franklin, ever the pragmatist, still considered himself a loyal subject of the British Crown. But his experiences abroad, and his belief in the power of reason, began to change that. In 1757, Franklin returned to London, not as a struggling printer this time, but as a representative of the Pennsylvania Assembly. His task, to negotiate with British officials over unfair taxes imposed by the Penn family, the proprietors of Pennsylvania. Franklin stayed in London for nearly 18 years, becoming the unofficial ambassador of America. He charmed English society. He dined with scholars, debated philosophers, and impressed royalty. Dressed in his simple brown coat, he stood out among powdered wigs and silk jackets. To the English elite, Franklin was the embodiment of the New World, plain-spoken, brilliant, and free of pretense. But beneath the civility, conflict brewed. Franklin saw how little respect Britain had for the American colonies. Laws were passed without colonial input, taxes were levied to fill imperial coffers. He began to write passionately about liberty, fairness, and self-governance. In pamphlets and letters, he defended the colonies with logic and wit. When Parliament passed the Stamp Act of 1765, taxing printed materials, Franklin testified before the House of Commons. His calm reasoning astonished the members. He explained that the colonies would accept trade duties but not internal taxes imposed without representation. His words helped lead to the repeal of the act, a victory that made him a hero across America. But the rift was deepening. Britain tightened control. Franklin's role as mediator grew more difficult. In 1774, things reached a breaking point when his private letters were leaked, correspondence between colonial officials in Massachusetts urging Britain to crack down on dissent. Franklin was blamed for exposing them, and during a humiliating hearing at the Cockpit in London, he was publicly scolded and insulted by the Solicitor General. He stood silent, his face expressionless, as the British elite mocked him. That day, something changed inside Benjamin Franklin. The loyal subject became the quiet revolutionary. He returned to America in 1775, just as the colonies were on the brink of war. The once apprentice printer, now a world-renowned scientist and statesman, stepped into the storm that would define the rest of his life, the American Revolution. And yet, true to his nature, Franklin approached revolution not with rage, but with reason. He believed that freedom was not chaos but the natural extension of human enlightenment, the next great experiment. Benjamin Franklin, Life and Discoveries, Part 3. When Benjamin Franklin stepped off the ship from London in 1775, the colonies were no longer the sleepy outposts he had left behind. Tension filled the air like a gathering storm. The battles of Lexington and Concord had already been fought, and America was awakening to the reality that reconciliation with Britain might no longer be possible. Franklin, at nearly 70 years old, returned not just as a famous scientist, but as one of the few men with the intellect, reputation, and calm authority to help guide a revolution. The Continental Congress met in Philadelphia, the same city where Franklin had built his name decades earlier. The atmosphere was charged with debate and fear. Could 13 scattered colonies truly stand against the might of the British Empire? Franklin believed they could, if they stood united. "We must, indeed, all hang together," he famously said, or, most assuredly, "we shall all hang separately." Though old enough to retire in comfort, Franklin threw himself into the cause. He joined committees, wrote policy drafts, and advised younger revolutionaries like John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. When Jefferson began writing the Declaration of Independence, Franklin sat beside him, editing sentences and sharpening ideas. He trimmed Jefferson's poetic phrasing where it wandered, insisting on clarity and impact. The document they produced was not just a declaration of rebellion, it was a statement of philosophy. "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." Franklin's belief in reason, tolerance, and natural rights echoed through those lines. He knew words could ignite a nation. On July 4, 1776, Franklin was among those who signed the Declaration. As he bent over the parchment, pen in hand, he smiled and whispered to a nervous delegate beside him, "We must all hang together." The hall was hot and tense, but in that moment, Franklin's wit broke the fear. But independence on paper was one thing, survival on the battlefield was another. The young United States was poor, disorganized, and facing the world's most powerful army. The revolution needed allies. And once again, Franklin would cross the ocean, this time not as a loyal subject of the crown, but as a representative of a new republic. In late 1776, at the age of 70, Franklin sailed to France on a secret mission to secure support for the American cause. It was a dangerous journey. British ships patrolled the Atlantic, and capture could mean death by hanging. But Franklin's courage was steady as ever. When the ship was tossed by storms, he read calmly by candlelight, wrapped in a fur coat, writing in his journal, "When I am dead, I desire no other epitaph than this, he lived usefully." When Franklin arrived in Paris, he was already a celebrity. The French adored him. To them, he was the embodiment of the Enlightenment, the scientist who had captured lightning from the heavens and the philosopher who championed liberty. He dressed simply, in a plain brown suit and fur hat, while French nobles glittered in lace and gold. They loved his modesty, his humor, and his charm. Parisian society opened its salons to him. Artists painted his portrait, women wore lightning bolt pins in their hair to honor him, and children waved miniature kites. Voltaire himself embraced Franklin in public, calling him the friend of mankind. It was not just flattery. Franklin represented a new world, where talent and virtue mattered more than titles or birth. But beneath the admiration lay a serious mission. America desperately needed weapons, money, and, above all, recognition as an independent nation. Franklin, alongside fellow diplomats Silas Deane and Arthur Lee, began a campaign of persuasion that mixed charm, strategy, and patience. He attended lavish dinners, whispered in corridors, and wrote essays that circulated among French intellectuals. He played chess with ministers, spoke with generals, and appealed to both reason and emotion. He knew the French didn't love America, they hated Britain. Franklin's genius was to make them see America's victory as France's revenge. In 1778, after news of the American triumph at Saratoga reached Europe, Franklin achieved what many thought impossible. France officially recognized the United States and signed a treaty of alliance. French ships, soldiers, and money began flowing to the American cause. It was the turning point of the revolution. Franklin's diplomacy didn't rely on power or pressure. It relied on trust. He once wrote, the best way to persuade others is with facts and a smile. He could be warm, yet unyielding. He could flatter kings while defending republican ideals. In a world of powdered wigs and secret intrigues, his plain speech was disarming and effective. The French adored him so much that when he fell ill, entire salons sent flowers and prayers. When he recovered, Paris rejoiced as if a hero had returned from battle. By 1781, the tide had turned. Thanks to French support and American resilience, the British army surrendered at Yorktown. But the war wasn't over until it was formally ended. In 1783, Franklin led the American delegation to negotiate peace with Britain in Paris. The Treaty of Paris was a masterpiece of diplomacy. Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay faced experienced British negotiators who hoped to divide them. Franklin's calm patience balanced Adams's fiery temper. Together, they secured terms that exceeded expectations: independence for the United States, generous territorial boundaries, and recognition of American fishing rights. When the treaty was signed, Franklin wrote quietly to a friend, "There never was a good war or a bad peace." After the treaty, Franklin lingered in France for several years, beloved by the people who saw him as a symbol of wisdom and reason. He attended scientific lectures, received countless visitors, and continued his experiments, even testing early theories of ocean currents and temperature. When he finally returned home to Philadelphia in 1785, he was 80 years old. Crowds gathered in the streets to greet him. The boy who had once fled Boston with nothing but a few coins now returned as one of the most admired men on earth. Old age did not slow him down. Franklin served as president of Pennsylvania and later as a delegate to the Constitutional Convention of 1787. There, as delegates argued bitterly over representation and power, Franklin sat quietly, listening. When the debates grew too heated, he would rise and remind them of humility. At one crucial moment, when the convention seemed ready to collapse, Franklin spoke. "The longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see of this truth, that God governs in the affairs of men. And if a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his notice, is it probable that an empire can rise without his aid?" His calm authority helped unite the delegates and bring the Constitution to completion. Yet even then, Franklin's conscience was not entirely at peace. In his later years, he became increasingly vocal against slavery. In 1789, as president of the Pennsylvania Society for Promoting the Abolition of Slavery, he petitioned Congress to end the practice. It was a remarkable act for a man who had once owned slaves himself. Franklin's moral evolution mirrored that of the new nation, struggling toward its highest ideals. He spent his final years writing, reading, and corresponding with thinkers around the world. His autobiography, unfinished at his death, remains one of the most famous works in American literature, a story of self-reliance, hard work, and curiosity. On April 17, 1790, Benjamin Franklin died at the age of 84. The city of Philadelphia fell silent. More than 20,000 people, rich and poor, black and white, citizens and foreign dignitaries, followed his coffin through the streets. On his simple tombstone are the words he had once written for himself. Benjamin and Deborah Franklin. 1790. No titles. No honors. Just a name, and a life that had illuminated the world. Franklin's genius was not in any single discovery or invention, but in the spirit that guided them all, the belief that knowledge and virtue could improve the human condition. He was, in every sense, a man of the Enlightenment, skeptical of dogma, devoted to progress, and confident that reason could make men free. He helped invent a nation, not by sword or crown, but by pen, wire, and kite string. His legacy lives on in every American institution that values learning, debate, and civic duty, libraries, universities, newspapers, and scientific societies. Franklin himself once wrote, "Energy and persistence conquer all things." More than 2 centuries later, that spirit still defines the country he helped to create. From the flickering light of a candle shop in Boston to the lightning bolt that struck the sky, Benjamin Franklin's life was a journey of illumination, one man's quest to bring light to the world, and to show that reason, courage, and curiosity could shape the destiny of nations. The end. What are your thoughts on this topic? Let me know in the comments below. And of course, like and subscribe.